Hobbits and politics is a very exciting spectacle.
Hi, thanks Naomi, thanks everybody for being here. Not for myself, but you know, for all of us, I guess, in solidarity. Last week I gave a talk in the occupied Maagdenhuis for a somewhat smaller group, and then I preceded that by saying that I had never been more excited and nervous in my life to give any talk in any context. But this is, again, like incrementally bigger on from there. Especially because, unlike what I usually do, which is prepare something and have like a really spiffy managerial PowerPoint with animated transitions and funky video clips packed inside, I decided that the context here requires something much more flexible and actually almost 100% improvised. So I feel like I'm putting myself out on a limb more than usual, but way less than all of the students who have been doing all of this amazing work in these past 2 weeks have been doing for all of our sakes. I got dressed up for the occasion, not because I felt that this was a formal event, but because I felt there's a kind of symbolic relevance to myself and a number of my colleagues today and tomorrow and over the past week giving lectures and thereby supporting this movement of the new university that is about opening up a debate about what a university is, what its function is, and what its larger importance is to all of us both inside and outside of it. So I thought if there's going to be pictures taken and video shot, I probably shouldn't look like a scruffy hippie in a radical t-shirt with a picture of Marx on it, but I should look, you know, a little bit more, you know, this is about as formal as I get. So anyway, it's my best shot. What I thought I'd talk about, I mean, my work has very little to do with actual direct action. I'm a media scholar, a popular culture fanatic, and a little bit of a, you know, sofa radical or a limousine liberal or whatever you want to call it. I thought I'd talk today about one of the things I'm working on right now, which is the connection between radical anti-capitalist theory and political action and science fiction and fantasy literature. So I'll talk about Hobbits and politics, but I want to precede it by a few things. First of all, what I've done, one way in which I've tried to support and contribute to this movement has been by organizing, by writing basically an open letter to the Minister of Education of the Netherlands and to the board of the Executive Board of the University of Amsterdam, which has been going around since Tuesday as a petition on change.org. I'm sure many of you have seen it, and thank you for signing it and leaving your thoughts. It's an initiative that I started together with Robin Selikatis, who will give a talk directly after me, and one of our graduate students, Sina Talachia. By now it has gathered the support of many, many internationally renowned scholars like Noam Chomsky has signed it, Judith Butler has signed it, today Etienne Balibar has signed it. Yeah, it's really incredible. And we're almost at 3,000 signatures for an open letter that will go out as widely as possible as a statement from the international academic community that are thinking about what's going on here and the kind of managerialism and financialization that has become to dominate academic life needs a radical change, and that is what this movement is about. So it's about that on the one hand, and on the other also acknowledging that what you're doing right now and over the past 2 weeks is a legitimate form of civil disobedience and protest that should not be criminalized and that should be listened to and that should open up new ways of thinking. Now I thought what I'd do, one thing I came across this morning, I'm not going to talk about zombies today, which is what I often talk about, what I talked about last week, but I will begin with a horror story, because I think it opens up a kind of an avenue onto a more positive way forward of thinking about this that I want to maybe try and pursue using a few other things. It's a blog post by a friend of mine and colleague at Marquette University, Jerry Canavan. He's a scholar of English literature of the 20th and 21st century, and he just last week wrote a piece on his blog called Universities, Mismanagement, and Permanent Crisis. And I think it's a horror story about something that has been going on that has been affecting the international academic community, but that is much further ahead in the United States than it is here. So while I want to make sure that this isn't interpreted as a direct indictment of what is going on at this university or in the Netherlands, I think what he describes in this piece that I think is worth reading out and listening to in full is what could happen if we push this further down the road. And some of it, of course, you know, use your imagination, may be used to apply here. He writes, universities mismanagement and permanent crisis, okay? He says, some loose, probably incautious thoughts adapted from a couple of Twitter rants/essays that I've been writing the last few days. It started with this Twitter post where he writes, the promise of the management class is that they could manage colleges better than faculty, and they have wildly failed at this on every level, right? That's the tweet that started all of this. He says, a multi-generation, multi-million-dollar institution like a college that has to administrate by emergency decree has in nearly every case been grotesquely failed by its leadership. And in the US today, that describes nearly every college and university in management rhetorics and policies dating back at least to the mid-2000s. That's a good decade, when I first entered the profession as a graduate student. If your college faced drastic emergency cuts after 2008, it was mismanaged. You expanded on an unsustainable basis, made the wrong commitments, and spent too much. If your college faces drastic emergency cuts now because enrollments tick slightly downwards in the 2010s, it was mismanaged. You had 18 years warning that this demographic wave was going to hit, 18 years to plan for what to do when it did. As every college administration invokes generalized, free-flowing, quote-unquote, emergency as its justification for arbitrary policy after arbitrary policy, all of which need to be implemented now, en toto, and without debate, even the ones that contradict previous ones, they are arguing that their management up to now has been so wildly and irredeemably poor that the university has been thrown into total system crisis. And yet, the solution to the emergency is inevitably always more and more draconian administrative control, always centralized under the very same people who took us over the cliff in the first place. Nor is there ever any accountability or so much as an explanation for how the crisis was ever allowed to happen in the first place, because very often, of course, the guilty parties have already fled the state and moved on to other companies. Eternal organizations designed to last forever, like universities, simply should not have to implement policy on a crisis basis over and over again, and much less be forced to implement every policy in this way. Colleges and universities should have been managed so carefully up to now that they can afford to phase in new policy changes over time, running experiments and pilot programs where necessary to ensure later success. That's what neoliberal shibboleths like nimble and flexible would actually mean in a world of rational management, graceful, deliberate movements, not wild lurching and uncontrolled crash landing. Careful management, good management, is the full and sole justification for the administration class that has bloated so entirely over the college landscape since the 1980s. I'm skipping a bit. He writes, Kahneman's razor would tell us that permanent crisis is a management strategy, the unacknowledged goal of every plan. But whichever precise combination of incompetence, dishonesty, and malice best describes a particular university administration is irrelevant. The management class simply has no reason to exist at all if their interventions in the university produce not stability, but crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis. Jerry's a smart guy and a great writer, and what he says applies almost 100% as a horror story to what happens if you move down that road. Which is why this signal, right now, right, when the institution like the University of Amsterdam is still, in principle at least, a public institution, a publicly funded one, and reclaiming it in this way is important. Because what he's describing here is really a kind of failure of imagination. Right? A kind of failure of imagination to think outside of a certain paradigm. And this typified, I think, the rationale that was put behind the eviction of the Maagdenhuis. There was no alternative, which really made me kind of laugh when I heard them say that. Laugh in a kind of sad way, because it reminded me, of course, of Margaret Thatcher's words in the 1980s when she insisted that the only way to deal with the miners' strikes and to put them down and to discipline labor, basically, was because there was no alternative. Because the only way to think has been typified by what Mark Fisher calls this framework of capitalist realism, right? That everything, hospitals, insurance companies, museums, and universities and prisons should all be organized like a business. Now, I've spent a lot of time trying to think about the connection between sort of this idea of a failure of imagination on the one hand, this sort of idea where both Slavoj Žižek and Frederick Jameson have often said, like, it's harder for us, it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than, like, the end of capitalism. Or even easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine, like, a small change in our political thinking, right, in our political system. That all of those things constitute a failure of imagination. And all of my work in terms of genre fiction, fantasy, and science fiction, these are all genres that supposedly in any case offer kind of alternatives, right? Middle Earth is like a whole other kind of way of organizing a society, which brings with it a kind of potential, right? If you think back, well, we can't really think back because I wasn't born then and hardly any of you were, in the 1960s, right? And of course the 1960s have been on everybody's mind in a kind of nostalgia for the student activism that created the moment of Paris, 1968, the occupation of this very building back then, right? That there's a kind of nostalgia for those moments where there was the ideal of breaking out of that kind of way of thinking. And one author who wrote, a pamphlet at that time, or a series of statements, was the French situationist or radical Marxist Guy Debord. And just this morning and on the train, I was reading his book, The Society of the Spectacle, looking through the notes I put in it when I was writing my PhD and all the highlights and stuff like that. And I know some of you haven't read it yet, but it's incredible. If you read it right now, it could have been written like today, It could have been written, I want to say it could have been written tomorrow. That's how vital and necessary it feels. What he writes about, or the way he defines the spectacle. And I was actually tempted, I thought maybe I'll just come in and read out of the Society of the Spectacle for 45 minutes. Nobody would mind. He writes, the spectacle is that moment, the historical moment, that corresponds to the moment at which the commodity completes its colonization of social life. When the commodity, in all of its many forms, from phones to pants to shoes to computers to movies to anything, is the only way we have of imagining our relationship to each other. And an institute like a university, that we become the consumers of a product that we purchase at a certain price. And that kind of market logic, the valorization logic, that this defines, like, if you want a good career, you need to pay first, you need to go into huge debt first, so you can go to one of those few institutions in the United States that allow you access to non-precarious employment later on, right? And as somebody who's been precariously employed by this university for 10 years now, my contract ends this year, so who knows what's going to happen next, I can really empathize with that position. Right? When he writes about the Society of the Spectacle, he writes about a society in which what we need is a clean break, right? A break from a way of thinking about each other and the things around us as simply practical things. What he calls for is really a kind of radical imagination. He says what we've moved to in this modern world, in a capitalist world, or what capitalism eventually does to us, is to break down our sense of time so that it feels like we're stuck in a kind of continuous present. This is the way that Frederick Jameson describes it as well, right? A kind of perpetual present of late capitalism, which means that we no longer have this sense to think outside, to think about ourselves as active agents in history, but simply as consumers within a continuously unchanging present, right? So the only thing you need to make sure of is that your phone software is up to date and that you have the latest model tablet and that you're fashionable and that you're going to the right movies and all that you've watched the latest cool shows on TV, etc., right? All consumer choices, yeah? So, turning this now to something like The Lord of the Rings, okay? And full disclosure, I mean, I grew up with like a hippie dad who was really into The Lord of the Rings in the 1960s when the campaign Frodo Lives had huge symbolic significance. And it's interesting because, I don't know, does anybody not know The Lord of the Rings? Okay, everybody knows, okay, right? It's about a bunch of white guys saving the world from disaster, right? And I think if you look at, white men, of course, if you look at narrative, right, as a kind of structure, it's really interesting to look at it from a political point of view because you can always ask yourself, is this story about change or about stasis? In other words, what are the stakes involved in this struggle, right? And saying it's a battle between good and evil is completely meaningless because those are very abstract notions that outside of history really have no meaning at all, right? So you need to think, what is at stake here? And you start studying a story like a narrative, like The Lord of the Rings, and you're like, wait, the stake here is protecting the Shire from change, right? Which is kind of interesting. It makes it, at heart, in a way, a kind of conservative fable. If only we can keep those nasty orcs and the evil of Sauron from invading our pure and unchanging environment, you know, of white heterosexuality, etc. Yeah? If only we could do that, everything would be fine. Yeah? So a lot of criticism about Tolkien has been, including my own often, right? I like to wag on Tolkien. Has been about this kind of conservatism. And people say you should look at science fiction instead, because science fiction is about imagining a future, right? Like Star Trek, that is rational and that is about utopian forward movement. But I think there's more to it than that, right? Fantasy has more to offer than that, just this kind of conservatism for a pre-modern, pre-capitalist age, right? There's something about this, the power of this phrase, Frodo lives, that is not just about the commodity, the successful commodity of a popular narrative and a popular product, right? It's something about the hope that people's voices matter and that small voices can trigger an enormous change, which is why in the 1960s, amongst the emerging countercultures of which we are basically, their legacy is what we're carrying on here, yeah? Which is why that phrase Frodo lives was so poignant, because it meant, you know, if you think about the story of the Lord of the Rings, for a lot of people, they don't have a lot of power, but they think, well, maybe somewhere Frodo is still alive and still moving the ring, right, which is the ultimate symbol for capitalism in a way. And if you think about it, you can think about the ring in a lot of ways, but I like to think about it as capitalism because its power is so overwhelming and so abstract that nobody can fully grasp it and nobody can control it, right? You're always tempted to put it on, but then when you do, you are sucked into a kind of pathetic, Gollum-like, you know, sense of addiction to what it does to you, and you have no control, no power to actually do it. And even Frodo himself can't, when faced with a choice, and I'm sorry that's a kind of a spoiler, can't destroy the ring. It has to be destroyed more or less by accident. Yeah? So the ring in the story is a kind of capitalist symbol. When you start thinking about it from that point of view, it doesn't really matter how the story ends and whether it's reactionary or not, right? What matters about, or what I think is worth salvaging, as China Miéville, the great science fiction and fantasy author of our time, the great political science fiction author of our time, has continuously insisted, there are so many elements that are so interesting and so exciting about the world of the Lord of the Rings, yeah? That are about imagining an alternative world in which we exist in harmony with our ecological environment. There's a very strong environmentalist current there. If we don't mind the radical sort of racism and xenophobia about, you know, thinking about a world where we're all afraid of orcs coming in, if we can step outside of that, then there is a huge kind of potential there. And I think this kind of thinking, right, about thinking what is worth salvaging, is also in this debate the position to take, right? The position to take. While I've been reading all of these comments on the petition for, you know, in support of the new university, some of the most interesting ones have been longer thoughts about how there's, you know, it's fantastic, first of all, that this movement is happening and that it's creating change, but that there's also a kind of danger for a nostalgic undercurrent, right? The kind of danger for saying we want the university to go back the way it was, as if it was perfect, as if it would be perfect if it were an autonomous and democratic institution, right? Those words, autonomy and democracy, are great, you know, attractive words, but they're not enough, right? They're not enough because they lead back to a nostalgic imagination of the university as a don't bother our privilege environment, right? That is only accessible to a kind of privileged elite. We don't want that. I mean, I don't want that. Yeah? We want it to be something new, something that moves forward through its past, right? Through an inclusive way of thinking about what academics do in the humanities, you know, because, well, that's the one I mentioned first because I'm one, but in every part of our massive university, thinking about how do we create processes of talking with each other that are, you know, in one way autonomous, that are in some way democratic, but not democratic in the way that our larger nation is organized as a democracy, but as a form of more direct democracy. And I think the great thing about what you guys have been doing, especially as I was watching this last night on AT5, is showing, you know, that that is a way to solve things, a way to talk through things, a way that can be inclusive and yet structured. I read a great book by Jeremy Gilbert, called, which is about how to imagine kind of, democracy in a post-democratic world, which is what we live in, according to him, right? The idea that there is some kind of shared space. And he said, if we go towards this environment that can be more utopian, that can be more about participation and about inclusiveness and about the university being more than just a kind of ivory tower of elite thinking, but a center for all kinds of thinking, a center for all kinds of discussion and debate. He says we need to move towards a way of thinking about our society that is no longer the society of the spectacle that is alienating us, but one in which we talk more and work less. And he says if endless meetings sound kind of unattractive to us, which of course it does, well no, most of you are Dutch, so it doesn't, but in Holland there's this great vergadercultuur, he points out that actually, like, a lot more meetings isn't so bad if your workload also diminishes, right? If you're no longer required to work so much, if you have more leisure time, which is possible, which some people call kind of a road that may be moving towards full communism. I'm not sure exactly what that is, and if it doesn't include Kanye West and Taylor Swift, I don't know if we really want it. But in any case, right, the road forward is one that includes the kind of debating, the kind of inclusive and participatory politics that you have been exercising. And I think, I'm going to end here because I'm now completely running out of breath, but to bring Hobbits into it just one more time, right? Bring Hobbits into it one more time. That idea of Frodo lives, that's been on my mind because that's the kind of hope and energy that I've been seeing here, right? As somebody who has become extremely cynical about his own work in the university over the past 10 years, where every next contract was followed, yeah, we can't give you a permanent position because there's nothing we can do, right? So you're going to have to just get by in one way or the other. In which every discussion with students about saying, we love these courses, but we would like to have more time to talk, which is every time, that's what comes out of the evaluation. Why can't we have more time to talk about this? Why can't we do what we've come here to do and which we love to do? Why does that always have to be limited to these 2 hours a week that we can talk about it, or else to, reduced to a kind of morculation? Why can't we have a freer way of organizing this? It's become, what you have done, for me personally, right, has wedged away out of that kind of cynical way of thinking about, like, that's simply the way it's organized and there's no way to change it, to starting to open up a space where you say, no, screw that. There are lots of ways of organizing the university. There are lots of ways of organizing politics outside of capitalist realism, outside of the society of the spectacle, and outside of the way that the managerial culture of the University of Amsterdam has become. That's all I have to say. Thanks for being here.